So let's start about the context of where we are. And I know I don't need to really spend too much time for families to know that we are really in an unprecedented period. And that is certainly true for attendance issues and the barriers that families are facing. Families are really, and students are facing exacerbated, unprecedented challenges. So we know there are many families and students that are navigating physical and mental health concerns related to COVID, but also related to things that either existed prior to COVID or have come now since that time. Families are facing employment concerns related to loss of employment and also related to changes in employment and how we are providing for our families, and financial concerns that stem from that, housing concerns and grief. And all of these factors, all of these challenges are leading to impact for students and how they attend and engage in school. Many families and students are essential workers. They work outside of the home, and that impacts the ability to oversee students and make sure that they're getting, when they're receiving remote learning, that they're getting the support that they need to access it. Families also have fewer supports and resources, many do, due to changes that have occurred during this time period. And also many families need significant support in order to access the new technology, the new platforms that are required for learning in the virtual and hybrid setting. And in addition, there's so much trauma that many families and students have experienced caused by racist reaction or responses to COVID-19, police brutality, anti-Black racism. And it's just a time that our students and our families really need support. Students with mental health needs are experiencing significant barriers, and we really see this. I think all of our organizations have seen this with a particular impact for students with mental health needs, but older students as well. So just, a few examples: students who are experiencing Zoom anxiety, pressures to have their camera on, and really, even as I'm interacting with you now, seeing yourself on the monitor, that can create a lot of challenges for young people who already have anxiety. We are seeing exacerbated social anxiety, also a lot of challenges that students are facing related to motivation on this new platform, and attention issues that are preventing access. So we know that students with mental health needs are particularly impacted right now with the barriers stemming from those needs that are preventing their access to school in the way that it was before, when they could be in person. So what are we hearing? So here are some of the things that we're hearing. So we've heard about families who have been referred to children and youth agencies related for issues that relate to attendance barriers and to problems that they're having with virtual learning, and then the consequences that come with that. Children and youth agencies are overwhelmed. Many don't believe that they have the tools to address these issues, where, as I've said, and I think I'll probably say many more times during this training, it's really an unprecedented time for our schools, for our children and youth agencies, as well as for our families and our students. So we really need to be thinking about what are the better solutions that we can use in order to address the challenges that students are facing at this time. So with that context, when do students have to go to school in Pennsylvania? So this is important in terms of what are the rules about compulsory school? What are the requirements there? And also at the same time, what are the rights that families have? So compulsory school age is when the time period where students are required to be in school. And this actually has changed this school year. not related to COVID. This was a change that was in place based on a change in the law that occurred last year and went into effect this school year, the 2021 school year. So children are now required to be in school from age 6 until they turn 18 or graduate. So in the past, students who were 17 were no longer subject to compulsory. When they turned 17, they were no longer subject to compulsory school age. That has changed this school year. So there's no, for students who were in compliance with the law leaving school last year at 17, there's no exemption now that the law has said 18. So those students need to be in school. And we've heard that there have been some challenges related to that. And also, across the state now, children who are 6 are required to be in school. And this was in place in some areas in the state, but not all previously. And just there is also a requirement that if a child is enrolled, many children are enrolled in kindergarten at age 5, if they are enrolled in school, they are subject, even if they're under 6, they're subject to compulsory school unless they're withdrawn from their parents. So a parent just can't stop sending their child to school. They're required to be in school. So there are consequences, and we're going to talk about what some of those are, but really focus on the requirements or the rights and protections that families have. And there are, I know that there are some, people may be asking about, there are some exceptions that exist for students who are working in a farm capacity as well. And so if you think that your student may qualify under one of those exceptions, you can contact the Education Law Center or one of our other groups to talk about whether they might be eligible for those exceptions. But largely the rule is age 6 until 18 or graduation. So I think it's, I'm a lawyer, and so I think it's very important to understand not just what the letter of the law is, but also why we have these laws, because that really helps us to understand what the obligations of schools, of other child serving agencies that are implicated in truancy, and what the obligations of our students and families are. So Act 138, which went into effect in 2016 and made some really significant modifications to attendance and truancy laws, that has a sad history of what led to that act, which is that a mother died when she was serving a 48-hour jail sentence for her child's truancy because she was unable to pay the $2,000 fine. And that death and her jail sentence and whether that could have been prevented with more intervention, that really sparked a debate in Harrisburg. And so it's very important to understand that the purpose of our act, our truancy law now, is to make sure that we're identifying and addressing attendance issues as early as possible. We want to avoid the unattended consequences and the family disruption that could come from a truancy finding and the consequences that come from that. And I'll talk about some of the protections that were put in place because of that, and with that purpose of making sure that we are addressing attendance issues early and not leading to the punitive consequences that could come after that. So Act 138 was in 2016, and Act 39 built upon that in 2018. In addition to the purpose of 138, some of the changes that happened in 2016 is that schools were not allowed to impose disciplinary consequences. So out of school suspension, transfer, disciplinary reassignment, expulsion for truancy. So schools are not supposed to punish students as of 2016 for truancy. And Act 138, the truancy laws, those apply to all LEAs, so all local educational agencies. So that includes charter schools, cyber charter schools, and really significantly, and we're going to talk more about this, is Act 138 required that schools hold a school attendance improvement conference before legal action be taken. So this is where I'm talking about the purpose is to really intervene and address the barriers that are preventing attendance before it gets to the point where a magistrate or other type of court is involved. Another provision that was added in 138 is to really just look at the absences in the current school year as opposed to absences that may have happened in previous school years. So those are some of the key changes in 2016. In 2018, there were expanded obligations that, or obligations were applied similarly to non-public students, and also, so non-public schools, commonly thought of as private schools, and also the 2018 Act 39 clarified that the rules for charter schools. So what are absences? What are we talking about in Pennsylvania when we're talking about absences? There are two kinds. There's excused and unexcused. And although it's easy to say excused or unexcused, it's not really black or white. So an excused absence, state law talks about those are absences for physical or mental health reasons or for emergencies. And school districts are required to have policies that explain how parents are supposed to document the excusals, but also what constitutes an excusal. So the policies need to be flexible and need to provide reasonable opportunities to provide the documentation for what is an excusal. And I think very importantly, for students with disabilities, the policies need to comply with special education laws. They need to comply with the IDEA that creates the laws related to IEPs and Section 504. They cannot discriminate against students with disabilities. So where we have situations where an attendance policy may lead to a consequence where a student who has a disability related need is being wrongly considered absent and not being excused, those policies need to be modified. And that can also happen with how families are supposed to be documenting their excusals as well. So it's important that we are considering what the impact will be to a student with a disability if there's a policy that is having a discriminatory impact. And so those are excused absences. We also have unexcused absences. So those are ones that an absence that doesn't fall under one of the reasons for excusal. And also an unexcused absence could be one that wasn't properly documented by the parent. And again, that schools are required to give a reasonable allowance for that. But if a family doesn't provide that timely notice, that absence could be considered unexcused. Some schools call an unexcused absence an illegal absence. So in addition to absences, it's important to know about what truancy, what the definition of truancy is. So truant under Pennsylvania law is 3 or more school days of unexcused absences. And there are protections and rights that are triggered when a student has 3 or more school days of unexcused absences. Those absences don't need to be in a row. Habitually truant, and again, there are rules that are triggered based on when a child is habitually truant. That is when it's an additional 3 or more days following when the student is first, or the family is first given notice about truancy. And I'll talk more about that notice in just a moment. So this is where we talk about the protections that are in place for students, not necessarily just, I think a lot of times people think about meeting the truancy definition and triggering consequences, but really we want families to be thinking, or schools to really be shifting that to think, when do we need to be providing more support, especially now in this time of COVID, when we know that the barriers are really significant. And oftentimes the root cause is something that school education professionals really have good tools to try to address those concerns. So there are protections within our law about truancy. And first, I mentioned when a student is truant, so when they have 3 or more unexcused absences, the school needs to send written notice in the family's preferred language within 10 days of that 3rd unexcused absence. So that's the notice that triggers the family to say, this is potentially a concern. So we need to start thinking about it. Prior to the 6th unexcused absence, so prior to that point when the student is considered habitually truant, the school needs to convene a school attendance improvement conference. I'm going to talk more about that because that is a really important protection for students and for families, but also a really important process. When it's done right and the way that the law intended, it can be a powerful opportunity for educators and families to come together to plan to address barriers. And I've been a part of that, and it's been really nice to see when that process that was put in place not too long ago has really worked to help students get back on track. So a school, prior to the school attendance improvement conference that we'll talk more about in just a moment, the school can't take legal action for truancy, can't institute some of the following, the other triggers that we'll talk about in just a moment until they've held the school attendance improvement conference. That's a first step. And as we talked about before, a protection is that absences can't be used to punish students. And, you know, it does make sense. If you have a child who is having concerns related to absence, it's nonsensical to think that we would suspend that child and not allow them to come to school. So those are protections that are in place for students. Also on this slide, make reference of the Education Law Center's Truancy and School Attendance fact sheet that is available on our resources page, which is at the end, which also has other resources from the Peel Center and other organizations that have put together. And many of these resources including our fact sheet, have been updated during this period of COVID as well. So the School Attendance Improvement Conference, again, it needs to happen no later than the 6th unexcused absence. And the goal of the conference is to identify the barriers with a group that is concerned and has tools to address those attendance issues for the student, and then create a plan that puts together what those tools are going to be and proactively tries to address the attendance barriers. And the school, when making, and we'll talk about some of those referrals that the schools are required to make at certain points, depending on a student's when the student is habitually truant, they need to provide verification that they have held that school attendance improvement conference. If they don't hold it, then they're not able to go further with legal action until they do hold that. The school attendance improvement conference, the parent and the student must be invited to attend that. They need to be invited there need to be given written notice. At least 2 attempts need to be made by phone, and the school needs to document their attempts to contact the parent. Although they're required to invite the parent and involve the parent, the conference must go forward even if the parent does not respond. And so they have, and schools can work to try and identify attendance barriers and address them. I think best practice is with the student and with the parent, but they can also be proactively trying to address those if the parent is not in attendance. And the conference also needs to attend others. I think noteworthy is if it's a student with a disability, who has an IEP or a Section 504, team members from those, either the IEP team or the Section 504 team, they should be invited, they should be included, so that disability related barriers can be identified and addressed through that plan and through those tools that are available there. So the attendance improvement conferences and the plan that's developed really need to be comprehensive. And as I've said before, look at really what the root cause of the barriers are so that we can address them at the school level and with the tools that we have, and also at the family, in the home, the level of the home, to try and make sure that students are able to get back on track. And barriers really are supposed to be considered holistically. So mental health concerns, bullying, although transportation isn't as much of a concern when students are virtual, it can be a concern with some of the hybrid models that we're seeing, or some of the person, also homelessness, unidentified disabilities. This is really the attendance improvement conference is an opportunity. Sometimes there are students who have really complex medical needs, but they haven't been identified by their schools as having a disability. And this is an opportunity to provide those resources and use and employ them to address address attendance issues. And this can also be an opportunity for the family to provide additional information about why absences that may have been coded as unexcused should have been excused. And schools may face some sort of difficulty in terms of legal action if they don't accept excusal notes from families, because that could be seen as arbitrary and capricious. So it's very important that the attendance improvement conferences are really looking at all of the different causes and thinking about how we can try to address them. So in addition to holding a school attendance improvement conference, schools have other obligations when a student is habitually truant, and those really break down into two categories based on how old the student is. If they're under 15, then they need to hold the school attendance improvement conference, but they also must make a referral either to a school or a community-based attendance improvement program, or to the local children and youth agency. Not every school has access to a school or community-based attendance improvement program, but those can be really important and best practice agencies in order to assist with assisting the school and the family to address attendance barriers. They may also the schools may also file a citation against the person who's acting as the student's parent. And then the Children and Youth Agency may file a petition to adjudicate. And you'll see I say the words may because that's really in the law, and there is discretion there on whether those are going to be occurring, as opposed to the must, what they must do. Oops. Sorry about that. I just went past the second. So I said there are some obligations for students who are under 15, but when a student is 15 or above, there are different obligations, similar but different. So in addition to holding the school attendance improvement conference, the school must make a referral to a school or community-based attendance improvement program. And again, I said, not every school has those, or they must file a citation against the student or the parent in magisterial district court. The school may refer the student to the Children and Youth Agency, and the Children and Youth Agency may file a petition to adjudicate the child as dependent. And also, if they do make a referral to one of those community-based or school-based programs and the student does not attend or has more unexcused absences, that may trigger that referral to CYS. So how has attendance changed in COVID-19? Just going back to the context, I think from the beginning, clearly education has changed in most areas pretty dramatically over the last year. And the barriers to attendance have also become different. We've had some that were the same barriers that we might have been talking about had we done this training in January of 2020, but we have also many new challenges that result from that. And also because of that, new obligations and guidance about what schools are supposed to be doing. So the Pennsylvania Department of Education, PDE, during the summer, they put out attendance guidance, which talked about the importance of schools to be proactive and to be really acting reliably about identifying students who are encountering attendance barriers. So making sure that they were looking at, that schools are looking at access issues and considering how access may prevent a student from being able to attend asynchronous, so a live, like we're having right now, a live class session or the asynchronous class session. So there are some, there's some flexibility that was built into that guidance to consider alternative ways for those children that have known access barriers, alternative ways that they can participate in school if they're not able to get on a virtual program. But schools during this school year, which there was more flexibility during the past school year when schools shut down so suddenly, but this school year, it's very important. PDE has emphasized that it is very important that local education agencies, so our school districts, our charter schools, our cyber charters, that they track attendance and that they report attendance to PDE. So those obligations are still there. But because many schools have changed in doing either all virtual or hybrid, the LEAs were required to develop their policies for attendance during those changed ways of attending school. And attendance really had to, how we were tracking attendance had to change depending on how children were learning. And what PDE, as I said previously, looked at, considering alternatives for children who had known access barriers. So it's not just about whether a student is logging on to a Zoom class, but if they're not able to do that, are they completing their work? Are they meeting the expectations of the school? So before we get to our resources and our Q&A portion, which will be in just a minute, we have some tips to address attendance barriers during this time. And I'm sure the other panelists will have other tips as well, but it's really important that you get a copy of your school's attendance policy. And you want to make sure that you understand what is an excused absence, what is not. And that's particularly true when we're talking about virtual and hybrid, as opposed to just in person. And also, it's particularly important that you know that school districts' LEAs can vary. So if you moved and your previous school district had one policy, it may be different in the new, and likely is in the new district. So pay special attention to the excusal note policy, how that process is supposed to take. And those policies need to be consistent with state law, but they can differ. If your child is having attendance barriers and having difficulty with attendance, I think the biggest tip that I have is make sure you have an open line of communication. So one we have on here is contact the school's attendance designee, the person who's in charge of attendance for the school. Make sure that they know that you are taking all the efforts that you can, your best efforts to bridge those barriers, address those barriers, and communicate them. I'm going to skip a bullet and just say, as I said, the communication, it's not just with the attendance designee, but also about other concerns that you may have about access. If you have a child with mental health concerns, if you have a child with a disability, if they are just not able to get out of bed because of concerns with depression or anxiety, communicate that. Let the school know, so that sort of shifts some of the obligation to the school to help you, to see what can be done. The bullet that I skipped might seem like an easy one, but you'd be surprised how often schools have the incorrect contact information. So make sure that they have your updated contact information so that they can stay in touch with you and that you can stay in touch with them. As well as communicating, you also want to make sure that you're reviewing your child's daily record so that you can make sure that absences are being coded correctly if they're excused or unexcused. And know your rights. So this is one piece of that. There are resources here, and this PowerPoint will be available. But if something doesn't seem right, if you don't think that the way that your child is being supported to address the attendance barriers is right, it may not be. So take a look at some of these resources that we have here. These are all links that are here, and the PowerPoint should be available to all the attendees. And I think that we're going to send an email afterwards as well. But also, please reach out to us. And we're going to move into the Q&A section. And I'm going to put on our contact information. So please reach out to us if you have questions. This is really just an overview of what those rights are. And when it comes to attendance barriers, especially during this time period where education has really been disrupted and changed, there are a lot of nuances. There are a lot of differences that, many of the barriers that students are facing are new and really do require problem solving, but they can be addressed. And the law really supports that families and students get that support and the protection so that they can be in school and be back on track.